Hi everyone, and you are welcome to Protected Access Modifier lecture. I'll start this lecture by a quick reminder about what an access modifier is. After that, I'll define what protected access modifier is. Then we will see the syntax to define this modifier, and I'll end up this lecture by a quick summary. So let's get started. In the previous lecture, we have talked about access modifier in general. And we see access modifier simply just a way to determine the scope within which we can access to attributes and methods. Also, we have mentioned that we have three types of these access modifiers. We have public, protected, and private. Mainly in this lecture, we are talking about protected access modifier. So, what's protected access modifier? Simply, when we say that this method or this attribute is protected, we mean that we can access to this method or attribute only within the class scope or within the children classes scope. From this definition, we can understand that protected access modifier impose more restrictions on the places that we can access to these attributes and methods from. But there is very important information I want to highlight that in Python, protected access modifier is just a convention and it's not imposed by the language itself. What I mean by this, I need you to know that the concept of access modifier is related to object-oriented programming, not to Python as a programming language. In Python, this concept is not imposed by the language itself, so the community developed a convention in order to use protected access modifier. So when you use this syntax, it's your own responsibility as a developer to not use protected attributes and protected members out of the class scope or out of the children classes scope. And you will understand this better when we see a real example using Python programming language. Now let's see how we can define a protected attribute or a protected method. First of all, you have to define a class, then you have to define a constructor, and within this constructor you will define the attributes that you want. If you want to make this attribute protected, all what you have to add at the beginning of the attribute name is just a single underscore. And usually we do the same thing exactly for the methods. So if I want to make a method a protected method, all what I have to add is just a single underscore at the beginning of the method name. Now if you try to access to these methods from anywhere using Python programming language, you can access, even though I define it in a different way. And this is just to emphasize the point that I mentioned about protected access modifier, that it's only a convention. It's not imposed by the language itself. Now let's move to Jupyter Notebook to see some code examples to understand what I mean by that about protected access modifier. Now let's understand in action how we define a protected attribute and a protected method. I'll use the same example that I have used in the previous lecture, in which we have two classes. The first one is parent and the second one is child, and child inherits the parent class. You will see here that I have one instance attribute and one method. And also I have one instance attribute here and one instance method in the child class. So how to convert a public instance attribute or instance method into protected? Actually, all what you have to do is just adding this underscore at the beginning of the name. So why I call all of these methods and attributes right now protected? Because we have this leading underscore at the beginning of the names, as you see here, here, and here, and here, and finally here. Now, from the definition of protected members, whether they are attributes or methods, they are accessible only within the class scope or within the children classes scope. But as I mentioned before, this is not the real case in Python. In Python, you can access protected access modifier out of the class scope or children classes scope. Okay, and let me show you this in an example. So let's try to get a protected attribute out of the class scope. So from this parent class, I'll define an object and I'll say print parent dot, let's say parent protected attribute, and run. I have an error because I haven't run this. So let me run this and run this again. And you will see that the value 10 has been printed out. So although it's protected instance attribute, I am able to access it in the main scope. Now let's try to call a protected method, and let me define an object again from the parent, and here all what I say is parent dot, and I'll take the method name here, and here I'll just print a dummy line, and you will see here the value is 20 because when I call this method, the initial value of this attribute has been multiplied by 2. So also I am able to access to a protected method out of the class scope. But look, when you define a method in Python, an attribute as protected, we assume in the community that this method should not be used out of the class scope or out of the children classes scopes. So if I have done something like this, if I call the method in this way, this is wrong and you don't have to do that. Now, let me show you the correct way to use such protected methods or protected attributes. First of all, I'll print this, and here because you have a method which is protected under the parent class, I could say if I want to use it, I could define a method here under the child class, and let's say this method name is just dummy, for example. I don't care about the implementation, I care about the idea, and now within this method, I'll say self dot, and because of inheritance, this method is accessible via self, and then I'll say self dot parent protected method. Okay, so here if I scroll down, you will see that I call this method within the dummy method. And this is what you have to do usually in your code if you want to define a protected method. Usually we use this access modifier in order to define the methods and attributes that the external user of this class doesn't need access to this method because they support the internal functionality of the class and they should not be exposed to the external user. And thank you very much. Now let's recap what we have learned in this lecture. Mainly, we have talked about protected access modifier, and we see that when we say that this method or attribute is protected, we mean that we can use it only within the class scope or within the children classes scope. And as I mentioned, this is just a convention in Python community. In order to define a protected attribute or a protected method, all what we have to do is just adding a single underscore at the beginning of the method name or the attribute name. Now please, I need you to refer to the challenges available in the lecture resources in order to practice what you have learned so far. Thank you so much for your time, and if you are available, join me in the next lecture.